So this morning we are going to cover the produce safety rule for growers under the FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, that FDA has released. And so hopefully after this presentation, you'll have a better idea of some things about the rule, just kind of a high level overview and some of the details that are included. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So first off, what is FSMA about? So this is the Food Safety Modernization Act. So it was signed into law in 2011, and FDA was made responsible for implementing the law. So basically, Congress and the president signed this into law and assigned responsibility to the FDA to implement what would become the most broad sweeping changes in food law since the 30s. And definitely a wide range of applications throughout the food industry from farm to fork. So it's not just focused on processors. And you'll see as we go through some of the regulations, there are also rules for importers and other aspects of the food industry as well. So the intent of this rule is to address what's perceived as an increasing level of risk to consumers in the food industry. At least that's my take on this, with an increase in food recalls that we see, and definitely an increase in imported foods and transfer of products between different countries and different companies. The food web has gotten a lot more complicated, and so this is kind of an evolution of the laws pertaining to the food industry in response to that. So also, we see examples in the news of operations that really aren't following best practices, whether it's a lack of awareness or for whatever other reasons. And so they're trying to promote some of these best practices that a lot of food processors are already following, that a lot of growers and a lot of importers are already following, but some of them aren't. So they're raising the bar for everyone, so to speak. So this morning we're focused on the produce safety rule, and I kind of wanted to just take a look at briefly with you an overview of some of the recalls that have occurred, some of the outbreaks that have occurred related to produce, and just to show that yes, there are mistakes that happen in processing, but there are also issues that come up with produce. And so you can see there are definitely a lot of issues that come up related to sprouts and leafy greens. And of course, there are reasons for that. They're definitely grown right in the soil and potentially a higher risk because of that. Also, with leafy greens, there's a high level of consumption of those items. A lot of people eat salad, and just by the nature of the fact that there's a lot consumed, there are more outbreaks related to that, if that makes sense. And then as you can see, there's kind of a wide array of different commodities that have been involved in outbreaks. So from fruit to herbs, berries, tomatoes, and melons, there's been quite a broad array of items that have been involved in outbreaks. And this data here, as you can see, comes from the years 96 to 2014. All right, so let's take a look at the rules that are part of FSMA. All right, so as you can see, the one in red is the produce safety rule. That's what we're talking about this morning. We've also got a rule for human food processors and, believe it or not, animal food processors as well. Then we've got the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which is intended to ensure that even imported foods are held up to the same standards that domestic are, which is a good thing because we want to make sure that folks that are growing overseas or processing overseas aren't able to get away with a less mature food safety program, and that we're protecting the general public from both domestic and imported foods from mistakes or issues that can occur in the food chain and contamination events, whether they be incidental or whether somebody intentionally may contaminate food or whatever other source it could be. And then we've got the Sanitary Transportation Act, or of Food and Feed. I'm sorry, the Sanitary Transportation of Food and Feed. And that is actually kind of an update to the Sanitary Transportation Act that I just kind of accidentally mentioned a moment ago. That was earlier on, I believe it was '05 when that came out. And this pertains primarily to items that are more vulnerable to issues during transportation. All right, so bulk items, exposed items. We're not talking about packaged food here. And also refrigerated items. So the items of primary concern are those that are exposed and could be tampered with or get contaminated, and items that need to be kept refrigerated or frozen for food safety reasons. And then finally, we've got the intentional contamination rule, which is primarily for food processors to make sure that they have good security programs in place so that things don't get tampered with at their facility. All right. So let's go ahead and cover the produce safety rule. So a little bit about the rule from FDA. The framework of the rule considers many factors that are associated with produce and the farming community. So they do look at addressing controls for the diversity of operations that are out there, because I think they realize that there are an awful lot of different types of farming and produce operations. And there are a lot of crops out there, a lot of different practices that are followed based on the industry. And so they have tried to address that through the rule. Of course, those there are those that would argue that maybe it's not perfect the way it's written right now, but they're working to continue to update it and improve it over time. And we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the presentation. And some of the sections that they're taking a look at, there are a couple of them that they're considering some updates to. All right, so it is intended to be an integrated approach that draws on current scientific information that we have. And the focus is on routes that we've identified that are potential routes of contamination rather than based on just commodity. And it does include an equivalent to the good manufacturing practices that we implement at the processing level, but they're more modified toward growing operations. So they're more geared toward the farm side. And as I mentioned in the chat earlier, you can ask a question in the little chat window. And in fact, I've got one already, I can see. These slides will be available to print. So after the presentation, we will share them with you. We'll definitely be sending those out. Okay, so this is a summary on this slide of the compliance dates. Okay, so what this is basically deadlines. This is when do I need to comply by? So you can see it's based on the size of the operation, based on revenue. And so the smallest businesses, 25 to 250,000, right? They have a little extra time. So you can see there's kind of a sliding scale here. And then small businesses, 250 to 500,000 in revenue, have a little bit less time. This coming January is the compliance date for the largest businesses, which is over $500,000 in revenue. And this is a sliding scale, so to speak, I guess, because it's a 3-year average in terms of revenue. And they have a document that they recently published that talks about adjustments to these dollar amounts based on inflation as well. And that's available on the FDA website. If you want us to send you a link, we can definitely do that. Just shoot us an email. And so as you can see, we've got some dates in here for sprouts. And then we've got some dates for other produce. The sprouts had an earlier compliance date. This coming January is the first compliance date for all other produce. And if you look at the column to the right of that, you can see the water related compliance dates. All right, and what this is this is the section in the regulation where they talk about control of water supply and monitoring the water quality to make sure that the water is not going to contaminate food products. And we've got a couple of extra years on those requirements, which is a good thing, because there's some things in the water requirements that will take some time to achieve. And also they're working on updating those because of feedback from the industry. And we'll talk more about that, but it's a good thing that we have a little bit of extra time. Now, this image is taken from the Produce Safety Alliance website. And so the URL for the website is right there if you want to go check it out. They have a lot of great resources on their website related to this regulation and to produce safety in general. And of course, any questions that you may have, you can always shoot us an email or give us a call, and we'll do our best to help answer those questions. So let's talk a little bit about what products are covered by this regulation. All right, so any produce that is a raw agricultural commodity is covered unless it gets an exemption. So this even includes fruits and vegetables and other mixed intact fruit and vegetables used in things like gift baskets. So not just boxes of produce, but it can potentially apply to some other distribution methods, things like that. And the term produce, it's a little bit of a misnomer. A lot of people think of the term fresh produce. They think of leafy greens, fresh fruit, maybe sprouts. But the term produce also refers to tree nuts, some beans, peanuts, mushrooms, herbs. So basically, just about anything of plant origin is included in this term produce. So that's important to understand that it does apply to a large variety of products and not just something that we might consider quote unquote fresh produce. All right. So exemptions, let's touch base on that. Now, the first exemption in the regulation is a specific list of items that they consider rarely consumed raw. So they did some research, they worked with the USDA on this, did some surveys based on consumer habits, based on the data that they have. They put together a very specific list, and they basically in the regulations say if you're not on this list, you're not on this list. So you need to comply unless you have some other exemption. So there are some discussions in some groups trying to get their commodities on this list. I know FDA has said that they will entertain those questions or those suggestions, but they haven't committed to updating this list at all. They're just willing to consider. And so parsnips, I mean, it's this specific list is the items they consider rarely consumed raw. Right? I see a question about parsnips. So if it's not on here, unfortunately, it's not one of the items they consider rarely consumed raw. And yeah, I agree with you. There are certain things you would look and say, well, parsnips, I don't know that those are very often consumed raw. I know there's some other items that people have raised questions on as well that are rarely consumed raw that are not on the list, or those that are on the list but people may consume raw. So they have a specific method that they use to go through and determine what would go on this list and what would not. All right. So, but let's talk some more about some of the other exemptions. All right, because there are a few others out there as well. So any produce for individual consumption or on-farm consumption. So if you're raising it for yourself, for your employees, you're not selling it to the public, those products are exempt. Produce that is not a raw agricultural commodity does not fall under this rule. If it's modified in some way, if it's roasted, if it's cut, if it's ground, it's no longer a raw agricultural commodity and it becomes a processed good. And so that falls under the preventive controls rule potentially. All right. Another exemption is farms with produce sales less than 25,000 a year. And so you saw on the compliance dates that the smallest category was starting at $25,000 a year. So anything below that would be exempt from this regulation. Okay. There's also an exemption for commercial processing, meaning, okay, in the photo you can see there's an example of peaches, or let's say I grow tomatoes and they're for canning or they're for paste. If I have a product that I'm growing that specifically goes to commercial processing and it goes through steps that will reduce the presence of microorganisms, as they say on the slide, you can see there, reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. So we're talking about E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, things that can hurt people. And so if it undergoes a thermal processing or some sort of processing that will have an effect on those organisms to reduce their population and render the product safe, then you get an exemption from the regulation, but you have to keep certain documents on hand. All right, so you have to communicate to them, as you can see in the first bullet point, that your items are not yet processed to adequately reduce the presence of those organisms. And then you have to get a written assurance from them that, yes, we're going to use this for canning, or we're going to use this for further processing that will reduce those organisms somehow. All right. Or you can get written assurance that they will label the products the same way that you have, stating they haven't been processed, and they're going to make sure their customer will process it further to reduce those organisms. You can get an exemption that way as well. And again, with that exemption, there are still modified requirements. There are still things that you have to do. Primarily, maintaining this documentation is kind of the main thing you have to do. Then we've got what we call a qualified exemption, right? And this is kind of a special category that a lot of folks won't fall into. But if you have less than 500,000 in annual food sales, and the majority of the food sales goes to qualified end users, which means directly to the consumer, or to a restaurant or a retail food establishment. And the term consumer does not mean a business. So when you say to the consumer of the food, it doesn't mean that you're selling to a business. You're selling directly to the consumer. So I think of fruit stands, I think of little stores that are on the farm, things like that. There are still some modified requirements you have to meet here, but there is an exemption for that as well. And so there's kind of an analog with this in the processing side, in that as a processor, if they're selling to another food processor, that processor will also follow under the same rule. But if they're selling to a farm or a retail establishment, I'm sorry, not farm, a restaurant or retail establishment. Restaurants and retail establishments fall under more of the county health codes, where they're inspected by the county. It's a little bit different. So that kind of aligns with this. All right, so let's talk about the definition of a farm. So how does FDA define a farm in this regulation? Well, one of the things that they do is, besides growing, the definition also includes some other farm-related activities. All right, so, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along, but they break the definition of a farm out into two sections. There's two definitions of a farm. So the first one is a primary production farm, and they define this as a farm that's under one ownership in the same general area, and this is your traditional farming operation. So it's devoted to growing and harvesting of produce. And they are allowed to process food that are consumed by the owners. But if they begin processing food for sale, then again, they fall under the processing rule. And that's the preventive controls rule, right? But certain activities are included in the definition of a farm. This includes packing. Treatment to manipulate ripening is still a farm activity. Dehydrating can be a farm activity, provided the commodity has not been cut or otherwise modified in any way. And then labeling also, because they expect to see some labeling, right? We're going to be labeling the packages or the bins or something like that. And that's included as part of farming activities. So now I have another question. So the question from Cindy is, what do you think of this example? We grow a ranch of tomatoes for saucing, farmers markets, and shipping wholesale. Right? Should we think about dedicating ranches to certain markets? So, I think we'd have to look at all the details of what you do and what exemption it might fall under. But I think they're treating a growing operation as a single business, right? So I think they go back to legal business entities. So if you had separate businesses, and you had one that was dedicated to uses that have an exemption, and then you had a separate business dedicated to uses where you have to follow this rule, that might work fine. I don't know how FDA would look at it if there was a single business that did both, because I don't know that they break it out separately and focus on just the part of the operation that falls under the regulation. They may, if you have one company that's doing all that, they may say, okay, only these plots of land fall under the regulation, and that's the only place that you have to follow the rule. I'd have to dig in more. So some of those exemptions are a little bit tricky to work through and to understand. Right. So, but maybe what we can do too is we can talk on the phone after the presentation, and maybe get into that a little bit more as well if you'd like to do that. So I can share my number with you as well, so we can talk. So in addition to your primary production farm, we've also got this secondary activities farm. Okay, so this is a farm that's not located on a primary production farm necessarily. maybe a separate business, but its function is dedicated to harvesting. So this includes hulling and shelling, or it can include packing or holding of raw agricultural commodities. So again, we're talking about produce that has not yet been modified or processed. And it's not necessarily located directly on a primary production farm, but it's farming activities. So in this case, there's a few little qualifiers. So the farm owner is the majority owner in the secondary farm, meaning, so if I'm a huller, sheller, or if I'm a packing house, in order to fall under this secondary activities farm definition, I have to primarily handle my own products, more than 50%. So as you can see on the slide there, the majority of the processed items belong to the same individual or entity. So now the entity doesn't have to be a single person. All right, so it can be a organization of, like a co-op or a business that includes several people. So it's there's some flexibility there, and this, I will tell you, is one of the parts of the rule that FDA has gotten the most feedback on and the most frustration with. People saying, well, hold on, I'm a packing house, just like the guy down the street. Now, he does primarily his own products. I pack other people's products as well, but we're doing the same thing. So why am I different? Right. So FDA is looking into that right now. I know there have been comments about some flexibility on that in terms of what they allow farms to do based on whether they fall under the secondary activities farm based on ownership or not. And I think they're intending to try and make this section a little more flexible because they realize it kind of doesn't make sense the way they've got it structured right now. Okay. So, but secondary activities farms can include the activities of packing, treatment to manipulate ripening, dehydrating, and labeling. Those same activities we talked about that are allowed on a farm are also allowed on a secondary activities farm. All right. So, non-farm activities, when we talk about food processing, let's talk a little bit about what's included there. So any manufacturing or processing beyond the definitions we talked about above will probably be considered processing. This includes pitting of fruit, cutting of herbs, trimming, peeling, chopping, and grinding, and producing flour. Making of chips was another example they specifically used, as well as roasting nuts and even sulfur treatment. So I know we have some farming operations that may sulfur treat and dry fruit. The drying is a farm activity, but if they use sulfur treatment, that becomes processing because they want to make sure that that sulfur treatment process is controlled and that it's done in a safe manner. Right. So hopefully that makes sense. But the way the regulation looks at when they say cutting and trimming, there are some activities that are still considered farming activities out in the field when people are harvesting leafy greens, for instance, and they're removing those outer leaves when they're peeling things like that off of the product. Minor cutting and trimming like that is still considered an agricultural activity. But once you bring those things into a building and you start chopping them, you start peeling the skin off of fruit and exposing the flesh that people eat and things like that, that's where we're starting to get into processing, and we're no longer under the farm rule. All right, so hopefully all this is making sense. Again, feel free to ask questions in the chat if you have them, and then I'll open up the microphones later in the presentation as well. So, but we do have a lot of information to get through, so I want to keep things moving along right now. So I want to give you a glimpse of the different sections of the rule here. This isn't all of them, but these are the sections that have requirements related to growing activities. It does start with subpart A and B, where they get into definitions and some of the legal speak in the regulation. But this is the meat of the regulation in terms of what you would have to follow as a farm. So subpart C is personnel qualifications and training, which we'll get into a little bit more. Health and hygiene, this is where the GMP type requirements are at, where they talk about rules for employees and visitors on a farm. Agricultural water requirements, we'll get into that in some depth. And I'll explain each of these subparts as we go through. Then we've got biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste. So they've got some specific requirements there. Then they look at domesticated and wild animals. And then, of course, growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities. And finally, the equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation. There's a section on that as well because they want to make sure that when we're handling and processing these agricultural commodities, that the equipment is clean, the tools are clean, the buildings are maintained well, and all of that. So let's talk a little bit about C, the personnel qualifications and training. So this applies to anyone who's in contact with food, anyone who's in contact with food contact equipment, and their supervisors. So definitely a lot of application in packing houses. Also, certain harvesting activities where food is being handled. If the harvesting in your operation is primarily mechanical, then there may be less of this that applies. But once the harvesting has been done by those machines and it begins being handled by people, then that's where this really applies more. Okay, so there are some minimum expectations for training of people here. So the regulation talks about providing adequate training relative to what the person does. So there's some flexibility there based on what they're doing. And they're looking for some basic food safety training upon hire and at least once a year after that. So we're talking about here's how you wash your hands, make sure that people understand that, because believe it or not, even some of the basics, sometimes people need to be trained on to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. Not everyone does those things the same way. Not everyone does those things as often. If you've ever been in a restaurant or someplace where you've been in the restroom and noticed people don't always wash their hands when they leave, that's kind of one of my pet peeves. And unfortunately, there's not necessarily always a common expectation that everybody follows there. So that's one of the intents of this, to make sure everybody understands that these are the basic rules that we follow on this farm to make sure the products are safe. You need to make sure you wash your hands, have clean clothes, and all these other things that we require you to do. So the training needs to be adequate to ensure that people are able to comply. It needs to be easily understood, and it needs to be repeated however often you deem is necessary to make sure that they understand and follow the rules. What we see a lot of times with growers is that there is a specific season, a short period of time every year where they harvest. And during that time, there isn't really a lot of available time to do training. So typically, the training activities are being done before season or at the beginning of season. And so that's kind of a good time frame. But other activities going on throughout the year definitely allow for further training as necessary. And they want to see some specific topics covered. Those are listed based on role and function, and records of training are required. So this is something that I think a lot of growers are going to find if you're not under a good agricultural practices program already. One of the biggest things that you're going to need to focus on is maybe keeping more records of things like training and other activities that you do that maybe you've done them in the past, but you haven't had those records to prove that you've done them. All right, so part of the training section, there is this one-day qualified training that you can receive that's been approved by FDA for growers and those that relate to growers, whether you're purchasing produce or overseeing an operation, but they want at least one supervisor or responsible party for the farm to have successfully completed a food safety training. And that food safety training they talk about needs to be at least equivalent to that would be received under this standardized curriculum. All right, so there's a standardized curriculum that the Produce Safety Alliance has developed. We are offering this training now. Safe Food Alliance is, and we're one of the first ones in the country, and definitely one of the first ones on the West Coast to be offering this. And so we're trying to offer as many as we can just to get it out there and make it available to people. So they're not specifically requiring you to attend this specific training, but if you don't attend it, you have to have an equivalent knowledge somehow. And so they leave it in the ball in your court. They leave it up to you. If you don't go to the one-day training, you've got to somehow have equivalent training. All right. So I have another question. It looks like FSMA is laying out specific tasks required, whereas GFSI schemes use the risk analysis and the determination of what the grower thinks is needed. Is that true? I think that probably is a fair statement. Okay, that under this regulation, They didn't leave flexibility for risk analysis in some of these things. They've got some basics that are required in terms of GMPs, but they do include some elements of risk assessment. So, with the water system, they want you to assess risk. With animal intrusion, they want you to assess risk. So, I mean, there is still a lot there in terms of leaving it up to you to assess the risk. Even with the training requirements, they want you to provide some training requirements, but they do say, as we saw on the slide, that relative to the person's duties, they want to see appropriate training that's adequate to ensure compliance, as you can see on the slide there. So there's still some flexibility, and it still is left, in a sense, up to you to determine ultimately what's appropriate for your operation. All right, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next section here, and hopefully that answers your question. Hopefully that helps. Good question, Priscilla. Once the one-day training is complete, does it need to be renewed annually? No, it is a one-time training. We haven't heard anything about them expecting you to do it again. It's just a requirement that any operation have a supervisor or manager, somebody involved that takes this training, so that they ensure that there's adequate understanding of the regulation. Okay. So, health and hygiene section. The focus is on preventing contamination from ill workers. So, ill employees shouldn't be allowed to work with produce. They need to notify their supervisor if they are potentially ill. And they must use hygienic practices. As you can see, we also need to make sure that we're making visitors aware of the procedures that we have on site, so that they're not breaking the rules. And adequate hand washing does need to be required. So these are kind of similar to what we would see in the food processing realm, a little bit more simplified, but definitely similar idea or concept. And I will make a comment, kind of a side comment here, as we talk about these things, that with with these requirements, I think for those of you that are involved in good agricultural practices operations already, you're going to find that a lot of these things you're already doing, and there's just a few little things that the regulation requires specifically that maybe you're not doing yet. But for those growers that aren't following GAP currently, they may find that there's a lot of things that they need to take a look at in terms of record keeping and official programs. Whereas, maybe in the past, it's kind of informally been done on the job, like on the job training. We're looking for maybe a more formal documented training program now. So that's just kind of one example. All right, so agricultural water, this is a biggie, guys. All right, this is one that's been kind of controversial. So I included a lot of details on this section just to give you some good information on it, and kind of help you understand what they're looking at in terms of water control. So the focus of the rule overall, they want to make sure that all water that is applied to produce is safe for the intended use. All right, so any water that you have in your operation is safe for its intended use. So if it's applied to produce, if it's contacting produce, they have some levels of sanitary. I don't know how to put it. I'll get into it with the criteria they've set up, but they basically set up some criteria, water quality criteria for those cases where the water contacts the produce. All right. Part of the requirements for the agricultural water, they want you to inspect the entire water system at least at the beginning of season and consider any potential contamination routes. But they do, I think they do probably expect you to be kind of keeping an eye on it continually, because things can happen and contamination can occur, whether it be, you use surface water and you notice that there's some kind of a dead animal that's in there, or if there's damage to your distribution system and the risk of contamination there, maybe got chewed on by rodents or something like that, who knows? But anything like that you're assessing for potential contamination routes periodically, just to keep an eye on things, especially as you get closer to that harvest period. And adequate maintenance of the distribution systems and of the water resources. And you need to implement measures to minimize the risk of contamination, whatever those measures would be. So again, it goes back to you kind of keeping an eye on things yourself, doing your own assessment of where the risk might be. They don't really have a specific method for assessing the risk of the water system. They just tell you to do it. So again, there is some flexibility there. And then if you are doing any water treatment to reduce microbial load to try and kill off any coliforms or anything like that, there are some specific requirements related to monitoring the quality of that water as you treat it. So as we talk about the water section, they kind of break it into two sections, right? They're looking at two different applications. The first one is production water, which is that water that's used out in the growing operation that comes in contact with produce during the growing period, right? So it includes irrigation, fertigation, foliar sprays, even frost protection, anything like that. All right. So I've been told stories about growers that take water from these holding ponds that have animals kind of swimming around. They've got wildlife living in the water pond there, and they take the water just before there's a frost, and they spray it directly on the produce to protect it from frost damage. And so, I mean, definitely understand the need to protect the produce from frost damage, and I definitely understand the reasoning behind that. But if you're going to spray it directly on the produce shortly before harvest, you don't want to be using water that living animals are swimming around in, like waterfowl or alligators or turtles that are definitely known sources of salmonella, because that becomes a real risk. All right, so production water, and then they've got post-harvest water, which is water used during or after harvest. And the little example photo to the right, you can see there's some radishes that have been kind of trimmed that are going through a wash process. Right, so there's an example of that. So as they look at risk with water, they have kind of this continuum, if you will, of risk. They look at it as being, if it's a public water supply, they look at it as being a lower risk because it's been treated, it's being actively managed by that public water system. As far as I know, I don't think there are a lot of growers using public water supply. I could be wrong in that, but I think most of them are using either ground or surface water. And so groundwater is kind of that middle ground where they consider it a little bit safer than surface water, but not quite as safe as public water supply. So you have to do some monitoring of your groundwater. For surface water, you're going to have to do more monitoring because it's susceptible to wildlife and things like that. All right, so let's talk some more details on that. And I apologize for the alignment there on those photos. So agricultural water quality. Okay, so all agricultural water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. So they've got this blanket statement that whatever you're going to use it for, it needs to be safe for that purpose and adequate quality for that purpose. So again, they leave some flexibility to you to determine and make sure that you're doing that. So anyhow, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here, and this will help you understand kind of what they're looking for right now. And again, this section here, as we talk about these numbers and sampling methods on the water, they are reviewing this water section. They are considering modifying it. And we have an extra 2 years to meet these requirements. Okay, so don't think that you have to go out tomorrow and start doing the sampling necessarily, although it would be wise if you can start getting data on your water in terms of micro levels. It would be wise to start doing so now. I definitely always encourage everybody to be proactive and start doing these things early rather than waiting until it's too late. But let's go ahead and talk about what they're expecting in terms of water quality assessment. So it applies to water used with a direct water application method to covered produce. So when we say covered produce, just to kind of call that out there, covered produce means any produce that falls under this regulation. Okay, so we're not talking about covering it with a tarp or anything like that. It's produce that falls under the regulation. So any water that is directly applied or comes in contact with produce that is under this regulation, you have to manage the quality of that water on the growing side. We're talking about every source of production water being tested to evaluate whether it meets certain criteria. So what is that criteria that we have to meet? Right, so if you're testing a well or if you're testing a surface water source, it has to have 126 E. coli or less. It's generic E. coli. And this is kind of a running average that they want you to do. It's a geometric mean. So they want you to take a certain number of samples to get a baseline, and then they want you to take samples periodically thereafter and maintain kind of a running average. All right? And then also they've got this statistical threshold value they want you to calculate, which is 410 or less CFU. That's the number that we get, the colony forming units of generic E. coli. So when you get a lab test and they give you a number, a CFU number is what they're usually giving you on these microbes. So basically what they're asking for is keep an idea of the running average of what your microbial load is, what your E. coli load is on your water in general on average. And then how much does it vary, the statistical threshold value? Do we see peaks and valleys a lot? Do we get these contamination events, or is it pretty steady in terms of micro load and pretty low in terms of micro load, right? And they just want growers to get an idea of and kind of continually monitor what the micro load is on the water. And I got a question here, and I think it's kind of leading into what I was going to mention next. So usually our lab reports a less than value. How do we deal with that and the math? So number one, with a lab test, if you have a count that you're shooting for, right, colony forming units, and you don't detect anything, then you'll either say non-detect or you'll say that it's less than 10 or less than 1 or whatever. And so that's probably what you're getting from your lab. The less than value means they haven't detected anything. Okay. And so that's a good thing. There's no detected value there. But as far as calculating the geometric mean, the statistical threshold value, there are a couple of spreadsheets that are out that were put together through UC Davis and through the Produce Safety Alliance. And we can send those to you as well after the webinar. And those spreadsheets allow you to just plug in the numbers you get from the lab and it calculates for you. So there's no mistakes or errors. And you don't have to buy a fancy calculator or anything like that. Because myself, I'd be afraid to try to do these calculations on my own in case I made a mistake anyway. So, but the spreadsheet is really nice because it calculates all that for you. It uses some conditional formatting so that it tells you basically whether you're in compliance or out of compliance. So it's really nice the way they've set it up. So we'll definitely send that to you after the webinar. That's not a problem. So we talked about 3 different sources of water. What do they expect us to do with these 3 different sources? All right, so for public water supply, they want you to get a copy of the test results. So whoever you're buying the water from is already actively managing that water source. They're doing their own testing. They should be able to send you the results of that testing. They should be able to send you a report. So with the appropriate documentation, there's no requirement for you to even test that water, which is nice. That's great, right? So for groundwater, they consider that a little more risky than public water sources, as I mentioned. So 4 times or more during the growing season or over the period of a year. So there's some flexibility there, right? So it's either over a period of a year or during the growing season. They want you to take samples. And then thereafter, they want you to have 1 or more samples per year that are rolled into the profile. So it's kind of a running average of the water profile that you're maintaining. All right, so the profile samples must be representative of the use of the water and must be collected as close in time as practical to harvest. Okay, so meaning a week before harvest, a couple days before harvest, or whenever you're able to get out there and get that sampling done to make sure that that water quality is adequate. And one of the things I've been recommending as they talk about the water sample must be representative of use. I think what they're saying is we need a representative sample of what's actually coming in contact with the produce. So I'm suggesting to people that they sample the water potentially from the source, like the well, but also maybe out at different points in the distribution, grab a sample out there off of one of the sprinklers or out of the drip system somehow or something like that to see what's actually coming out at the other end in case the water system is somehow compromised or contaminated, because that can happen. All right. So groundwater was 4 or more times during the growing season and then at least once a year thereafter. For surface water, it's definitely more risky. And so they're looking for 20 or more times over the period of 2 to 4 years, and then 5 or more samples every year after that. All right, so that way you get a good idea of what level the water is at. And this is part of the reason why I say that growers should consider starting this analysis process now and just really getting data as they can to go ahead and get an idea of where their water quality is. But one of the limiting factors on this is the method that they want you to use is not widely available. And I'll talk more about that on one of the later slides. But that's one of the tricky things, which is part of what has been submitted to them as comments is, can we use some other method? Because this one that you're asking for is not widely available and it's a little bit problematic. So we'll talk about that more in a few slides here. So then there is a water quality criterion for harvest and post-harvest activities where the water used must have no detectable generic E. coli. So I just talked about the water quality used on the growing side, right? So the quality of the water used when you're growing produce, that you're applying it to the produce or it's incidentally coming in contact with it. We've got to do this ongoing analysis and understand where the overall micro load is and make sure it's below that threshold. Now in the packing shed, in the processing side, not processing, I guess I shouldn't use that term, but the post-harvest side, where we're rinsing things off and packing them into boxes and that sort of activity, there should be no detectable generic E. coli because that's the process right before the consumer. So they want to make sure that there's no detected E. coli in that water. All right, and so anything that's coming in contact with the produce or the food contact surfaces, or even to make ice that comes in contact with produce, or for hand washing as well. Same criteria for hand washing. So we're basically looking for, just a high level of quality of that water because people's hands may come in contact with produce as well and things like that. So untreated surface water may not be used for these purposes. All right. So now I have another question. If we have been in an audited GFSI level scheme for the past years, taking samples one time per year, should we start the 4 samples now or next season or some other alternative, right? So, that's kind of what I was referring to with the GFSI programs or the GAP programs, that it really sets you up well in terms of compliance with the regulation because you're already starting to get some of this data. You're already kind of on the path to compliance. The problematic thing here, though, is the method that your lab is using may not be the method that we're looking for under this regulation. So it gets a little tricky, right? So again, just do what you can right now. If that's the test that your lab has available, then that's what I would be using for now. Our lab does offer in Fresno the method that FDA wants, but it's not widely available yet. So, but should you start taking the 4 samples now or next season? So I would just go back to that, 4 samples over the course of the year or during the harvest season, whatever works best for you. And you've already got a history there. You've already got samples that you've collected over time. Okay, so it's not the method they're looking for, and I'll go ahead and go to the next slide to explain that. But at least it is data that's valuable data that you have. So the water test. Currently, they're looking for what they call method 1603. It's a specific method that works really well, but it's problematic because few labs offer it, and there's a 6-hour window between when the sample is taken and when it's given to the lab. It's 6-hour max window. You've also got to put it in ice during transport and storage during that 6 hours. So it's a very problematic situation in terms of trying to meet that requirement. So as you can see, FDA is currently reconsidering this aspect of the rule. So I got a little snip there from their website. There's a little release on their website saying that they're exploring ways to simplify the microbial quality and testing requirements. What that means, I don't know. They don't really discuss or widely disseminate information about ongoing discussions like that. What usually happens is they'll discuss it, they'll come to a potential solution, and then they'll send that out and let people comment. So eventually, once they discuss this and they come to a conclusion on what changes they may want to consider making, what they're going to do is release it for comment to growers and to the public, and we'll be able to take a look at their recommended changes, and we'll be able to comment on them, and then they'll finalize those changes. Okay, and that's kind of the way they usually work. All right. Another question. What is the name of the test method we should be using? And it's right there on the top of the slide. It's method 1603. Uh, and as I said, a lot of labs don't offer it yet. I think that they will start to probably because of this need for the method. I do know, as I said, our Fresno lab does offer that method. We're talking about implementing it also in our Yuba City lab. But I know for some of you that may not be helpful because those locations may not be convenient. So I definitely encourage you to kind of stay in tune on the news on this. I will say too that we do cover these issues in our newsletter and things like that. So if you want to sign up for our newsletter, you may be able to get updated on kind of the latest developments. And what is the name of our lab? Well, we're the Safe Food Alliance. We're also known as DFA. And so we can definitely send you contact info for the Fresno lab as well if you'd like. So looks like I'm running a little behind on the presentation here because we're getting close to 10 o'clock. And so we will definitely send these slides out to you so you can review them. I'm going to try and just get through these quickly and kind of give you a high level overview of the remaining slides. And we'll kind of go from there. And as I said, feel free to call me. I'm going to go ahead and enter my phone number into the chat, and you can take it down if you want. You can give me a call, and hopefully, if you have any questions, I can help answer them. So my phone number is in the little chat window there for you now, and you can go ahead and give me a call later after the presentation if you want to talk. I do have a couple of meetings today, but give me a call, leave me a voicemail if I don't answer. Or you can call the office and talk to Anila, and she may be able to direct you to someone that can help. So we do have some requirements for soil amendments. Specifically, they're concerned about animal waste and human waste, which is more of an issue overseas really than it is here in the US, and how animal and human waste are managed. So they've got some requirements in terms of using raw manure, or if you are composting, making sure the composting is effective and it's a validated process for composting. So they do refer back to the National Organic Program of the 90-120 interval for raw manure if you're going to use raw manure. And so we definitely talk quite a bit about this in the one-day training as well, but I'm going to go ahead and skip on to the next subject. They're looking for control of domesticated and wild animals as a potential source of contamination. A lot of farms have maybe dogs or feral cats, or you get deer, you get maybe potentially boar or other wildlife, or even birds. So they want you to assess throughout the season as needed, and also prior to harvest, assess the crop and go around and look and make sure there's no evidence of contamination. So if you see any droppings on the produce or anything like that, they want you to make sure it doesn't get harvested, to somehow mark off that area and not harvest those crops or something like that. And so we're looking for any activities such as live animals or droppings, excreta, or destruction of crops that would indicate animals have been there chewing on them. Okay. One of the things with wildlife that they do specify is they're not asking you to go out and the taking of endangered animals is discouraged. So they're not asking you to go out and shoot or hunt the animals or anything like that. But they do want you to protect the food that you harvest and make sure that if you harvest it, that it's safe. That's kind of the bottom line. Okay. They've got some requirements for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities, which is related to cleaning and sanitation of the equipment and things like that, and preventing contamination of produce, and also not packing and shipping dropped produce for certain types of crops. So crops like carrots and melons that come off of the ground, there's less of a concern there, but produce off of trees and things like that, if you drop it, then they don't want you to harvest it. And then they also look at packaging, making sure that it's appropriate for the commodity so it won't be a source of contamination. Equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation, they've got some requirements around that related to GMP. I think I can kind of skip over that. Sprouts requirements. There are some requirements specifically for sprouts as well, and I don't think I need to get into much detail there. Needless to say, if you produce sprouts, there's definitely some requirements that you need to be familiar with. So, and again, this slide is about sprouts, so I'll go ahead and pass that. I got a question here. Typically, we do a preseason ranch audit Do you think this action would fulfill the FSMA rule of animal intrusion monitoring? Potentially, it definitely could. Depending on your commodity and what the risk is, what sort of animals you see, but doing a pre-season audit before you harvest is kind of the idea. So I think I'm assuming maybe you're doing that under your current programs for GFSI or for GAP, and that's kind of one of the examples of where those programs really prepare you well for coming into compliance with this regulation, because it's already got some similar structures. And I think even when they developed this regulation, I think they definitely took a look at the existing programs out there in terms of good agricultural practices and GFSI, and I think they took some learnings from those as well. So there are definitely some records requirements here, as you can see on this slide. So the name and location of the farm, the actual recorded values, and information on time, date, and the person signing the form, all of that needs to be there. So just best practices for records need to be followed. They need to be retained for 2 years plus, right? So at least 2 years is the absolute minimum. And they need to be true records. They also need to be made available to FDA upon request. Okay, and so that is something that we make sure everybody understands. They need to be available if FDA requests those records. So here's a comment about GFSI that FDA has made. I thought that would be useful for those of you that are involved in those programs. So they do not consider GFSI programs as equivalent to the regulation. They're still very good at preparing you for compliance with the regulation. What they specifically say is, to the extent that certification schemes or food safety programs are consistent with the produce safety regulation, then compliance with those schemes or programs could be relevant, right? And so they say they reviewed widely used schemes and programs in developing the rule, and they note there are a lot of consistencies with several of the rule's provisions. Okay, so then the next slide, I talk about GAP. This is what FDA says about GAP, and this will be basically the last slide in terms of content on the webinar here. So other GAP programs, they say that we decline the request that FDA recognize certain commodity-specific guidelines developed by industry, such as citrus GAPs, as an acceptable alternative to the produce safety regulation. Alternatives are permitted only for specific requirements. Basically, they're saying we allow some alternatives on some of the requirements like agricultural water controls and things like that. There's some flexibility there, but when they say you've got to do X, Y, and Z in the regulation, you've got to do it. There's no alternatives such as, okay, you do citrus GAP, well, then you don't need to meet the regulation. So there will be a lot of similarity between the two, but it is still your job to make sure that you understand the regulation and that you're complying with it. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you need help, FDA has this technical assistance network available on their website. And it's a place where you can go in and ask them a question directly. There are also lots of documents posted on their website. The Produce Safety Alliance also has a technical assistance network, I believe, and they have lots of documents posted on their website. And there are various training programs and things like that. Part of that is the one-day training that we're offering. We were trained by the Produce Safety Alliance as part of that program. All right, and then so finally, we are definitely here to help as well. So email us your questions, call us with your questions. We do webinars, we have on-site training, we're doing the public trainings. One of our public trainings is coming up is at Safe Food California in June. That's our annual conference on food safety. So be a great place to go get that training and also connect with other people, see what's going on in terms of food safety in the bigger picture. There will be processors there as well, and other folks. We also do lab testing, we do consulting, and we have training programs that we can customize. And I've got a few questions here. So when will GFSI and FSMA become parallel, if ever? Are folks working on that? And yes, from what I'm hearing from the industry, many of the GAP programs, some of which fall under GFSI, many of them are updating their programs to include FSMA requirements, which I think will be really beneficial to growers, because once they include those requirements in the GAP program, all you'll have to do is certify to your GAP system. All right. Are there any scholarships for the training? So I know California Walnut Board has been doing some scholarships for walnut growers. I'm not aware of any others, but there may be. And I would encourage you to reach out to the Produce Safety Alliance and ask that question as well. But I'm unmuting the microphones now in case anybody has any questions they want to ask verbally, and we can just chat. We can discuss as needed. So hopefully that helps answer those questions. But as I said, I've got the microphones open, so let's talk. Do you have any other questions?
Hey, John, can you
Yes.
hear me? This is
Yeah, I
Cindy.
sure can.
I noticed that there is also a training for like a qualified, I forget what it's called.
Yeah, PCQI, right?
Right. So can you explain the difference between the two trainings and why one might do one and or the other?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a great question. So that's something that is kind of confusing to a lot of people. The PCQI is for the other FSMA regulation, the processing side. The other difference is it's 2.5 days. So by the end, you're going to be exhausted. So thankfully, the grower training is 1 day. They got a lot of feedback from growers and other folks in the industry that, if you can fit it into 1 day, that's what we'd rather do. And so that's what they did. And they went through several iterations of that training before they finally got the current version that's approved by FDA. It took them a lot of work and a lot of time. And that's why we're in this situation now where the compliance dates are coming up for the largest processors this January. And the training is just now starting to become widely available. So that's why we're trying to offer it as much as we can. So did that help?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so the qualified individual part for produce isn't that's not something that's in FSMA.
Yeah, there is this preventive controls qualified individual. That's the preventive controls rule. That's what the PCQI stands for. So it's the other rule. They do
Okay.
use the term qualified individual in the preventive controls rule, and I believe that's in the produce safety rule as well. But it's just around being qualified to do your job. So that goes back to that
Okay.
on the job training.
Okay.
If
Okay.
that does that help? Yeah, hopefully that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, what else? Do you have anything specific to your commodity or anything on the water testing?
Sounds like we're gonna get some more information later, so maybe we shouldn't do much until it's finalized.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, if you're already doing water testing, it seems like it might make sense to just do what you're doing for now and just continue. And then maybe in a year or so, or 6 months, maybe whenever they get it out, hopefully we'll get an idea of what changes they might make. The thing with FDA is you never know how long it's going to take or what they're going to come up with because they're very hush hush about what they have going on. They don't really share it because
Right.
they don't want feedback until they're done discussing it and it comes out. So we don't have any idea in terms of when it'll come out or what changes will be made.
And you'll be able to email us or send us a link for that spreadsheet.
Yeah, definitely. I think I can just attach it to an email and send it to you. And
Okay.
so we'll send you a copy of the presentation, and there's two spreadsheets, one for groundwater and one for surface. So we'll send you both of those. And I can also tell you that the website UC Davis where they posted them, I believe it's the UC Davis website. They've got some instructions and things there too. But anyhow, we'll definitely send you some more information to follow up. Um, And I forgot to put the last slide up. Here's our contact information for our corporate office. I've also got my email on there as well. So, anyhow, well, hopefully
All
that
right.
helps. Hopefully that helps you understand the regulation a little better. We are here for questions if you have any, and definitely want to help as much as we can. So,
All right. Thanks a lot, John.
yeah, definitely, no problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Priscilla, yes, I will be emailing the slides out.